So if you don't know, my name is Becca Camel, and I am the program outreach here in Chapman. I'll help you. And tonight is our first Conversations to the Past for 2025. So we have a whole nother year of lectures each month. This is a recurring series. So if you'd like what you see tonight and you want to come back next month, I'll find out. So tonight, we are very lucky to have two members of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance presenting with us. We have John DiNuzzo, who is the president of the Lake George Battlefield Alliance, as well as a trustee of the Warren County Historical Society.
People, all sorts of excuses.
Margy serves as the municipal historian for both the town and village of Lake George, and she is a trustee of the Lake George Battlefield Alliance. Both John and Margy are also members of the Warren County Commission for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, coming up next year. And their talk tonight is going to cover the history of the park. It's going to include some key activities that occurred on the grounds during the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. And they're also going to share a little look at the planned 2026 reinterment in the park of 44 Continental soldiers and others who perished at Lake George in 1776. So now I will turn it over to John and Margy for their talk. Lake George Battlefield, history, and future.
Fix this.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
And welcome. I'm John DiNuzzo, as you might have guessed. Thank you. I'll put it on in a second. Just a few things to say before we get rolling here. Number one, we have literature up front. 4 excellent pieces. We didn't bring our whole repertoire, but we do have upcoming events, which I think a lot of you have attended before, are very interested in. So please take the literature. Upcoming events, we have a membership form for those who are not members. We probably have half the group is a member right here. We have the Repose of the Fallen. That's the project that Becca was just referencing, where we're going to reinter the remains of 44 Continental soldiers that were found in the village in 2019. They will be reinterred at our Lake George Battlefield Park, where we already have 4 unknown soldiers on Memorial Day weekend of next year, 2026. And finally, we have a very popular walking tour guide of Lake George, including many stops in the village, our own Fort George and Lake George Battlefield Park, Fort William Henry, the Old County Courthouse, other places in the village that have great history to them. It's a beautiful document that was produced a few years ago. I'll also like to tell you, for those who don't know, that we have a very short radio program on Lake Radio, 93.5 FM, Saturdays at 9:40 a.m. It's only like 2 minutes long. But we have a podcast that expands on that, that is uploaded every Sunday on our YouTube channel, Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance YouTube channel. And that's pretty interesting. I know some of the people were talking tonight about what they've heard. Well, Lauren Roberts, the Saratoga County historian, was a guest on the most recent program. But we've had people of various degrees of history knowledge from various areas coming up and talking to us on this program about some of the key things in colonial history at Lake George. Margy, as Becca said, is the town historian and village historian of Lake George, in addition to being a member of our board of trustees, a member of the 250 Commission for Warren County. And she's going to introduce us to several areas of orienting us to Lake George Battlefield Park, particularly the pre-colonial history. Margy?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. Let's see. When the state was rerouting the road around the beach, the $1 Million Beach, they at first came through the next to the beach, but then they changed the parking lot and rerouted the road. And when in doing that, the New York State Museum, the archaeologists from the museum came and discovered some artifacts in that area, right at the base of the park and base of the, right across from the parking lot for the $1 Million Beach. And they have dated the artifacts there back 8,000 years. So we're basically going through a timeline of things that happened at the site where Battlefield Park is located now. And one of the first things that's recorded in history is Father Isaac Jogues coming through the Lake Champlain and Lake George, and he was one of the first white men to set eyes on the lake and renamed it Lac du Saint-Sacrement, or Lake of the Blessed Waters. And he was a French missionary who came to the area to try to get the Indians to become part of the Catholic Church. And he was here, he was captured by the Indians and martyred and sacrificed and eventually killed. So he is represented in our park. Fort George was located in a very strategic part of the waterway. From here, you can see this is an early map, the Hudson River coming up, and the Great Carry from Fort Edward to Fort George, and then up through Lake George into Lake Champlain. So whoever controlled the waterways were going to control the country. And lots of battles occurred around here, and history has been made. Okay?
There we go.
There we go. All right, so John is going to go through the battle history and take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Margy. So yeah, most of the notoriety, if you will, about Lake George Battlefield Park revolves around the role that it would play in the French and Indian War, which basically ran from 1754 to 1763, and the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The Battle of Lake George was the first component of that, and first significant victory for the British in the French and Indian War. Up to that point, again, the date is September 8th, 1755, the British had sustained significant losses, particularly at what's now Pittsburgh, the Fort Duquesne, when the French, despite an inferior number of forces, pushed back the British, killed General Braddock, and as was said, George Washington, who was part of, was a captain or colonel under Braddock, was part of the reason the British did so poorly there. He made some poor choices, kind of egged on the French and their native allies, and as a result, the British were beaten back. So part of the strategy that Britain had was a four-pronged takeover of the French forces, the French fortresses in North America at this point, with Crown Point being one of the four keys. As I said, they lost at Fort Duquesne. So it became very important to them. And William Johnson, who was a key landholder in the Mohawk Valley, was designated to be the commander-in-chief of the forces that would take on Fort Crown Point. So in August of 1755, Johnson and his forces came up to what was then called Fort Lyman, and later in the year was renamed Fort Edward, and blazed a trail from Fort Edward to the head of Lake George, the southern end of Lake George, which had not been done before. I mean, there had been some Indian trails in the area, but no passageway. And from that point on, it became the military road between Fort Edward and Lake George, a key component. It's a great illustration we'll be showing you. One of Johnson's allies, a key ally, was his King Hendrick, a sachem or a superior chieftain within the Mohawk community. And even though the French and Indian War kind of connotes that the Indians were aligned with the French, in the case of the Mohawks, they stayed with Johnson and the British because of Johnson's relationship with King Hendrick and other components of the Mohawk nation. So in late August of 55, they came up from Fort Lyman, Fort Edward, to Lake George, blazed the trail, created the military road, and then began to strategize about going on to Crown Point and taking that back from the French. Next slide, please. So what happened, there we go. On that morning of September 8th, 1755, the Bloody Morning Scout, there's 3 elements of the Battle of Lake George, all on September the 8th. The first is Bloody Morning Scout. When Johnson got word at Lake George that the French forces might be advancing on Fort Lyman, he decided to send a contingent of British and a contingent of Indians down that way to render assistance to the British fortress at Fort Lyman. Before they got about 3 or 4 miles beyond Lake George, heading south, they were ambushed. And this depicts Colonel Williams, the commander of the British forces, for whom Williams College is named, and King Hendrick both were killed in this early Bloody Morning Scout. It was a complete surprise to the forces heading south. Now, these forces, although they were British fighting for Britain, they were primarily Americans. All but one were provincials, and provincials meaning they were American-born, American-raised, not from England. And so they were kind of conscripted into the British military to fight for them. So their first battle, by and large, many of them ran and hid. They basically fled back north. And Johnson, meanwhile, because it was only 3 miles away, heard the gunfire, heard the battles going back and forth, because there was no other noise in the area at that point. And he began to fortify on an improvised basis the area that we now have as Lake George Battlefield Park. So the first skirmish, the first engagement was a crushing defeat for the British at the hands of the French. Next. So next up, they come back to Lake George. Now, to reorient us, we're used to seeing north at the top. North is to the right here. So you see Lake George and the bateau or canoes at the shore of the lake. That hook is basically how the British improvised their defensive lines as the British were coming. We have a member of the Battlefield Park Alliance named Mark Silo, who outlined, in fact, it's available on our website, just where Johnson's lines were, most of them at Lake George Battlefield Park, to head off the French and the Indians that were coming to attack. So you see, this is the upper right of the hook there. That's basically where Route 9 is today. The Battleground Campground, the Tiki Motor Lodge, places like that, that's at the top. The bottom is basically right along the ridge of the Battlefield Park where the bike route goes now. And you can see this roadway right here. That is Military Road, and that is what's now Fort George Road. So that road that was cut just a couple of weeks earlier by William Johnson's forces existed then and still exists today primarily, particularly in our area. It's pretty much on the same footprint of the military road that Johnson blazed through. So the British successfully pushed them back, and the French ultimately were frightened by what was happening. Many of their Indian allies did not come north with them. They wanted to stay back and plunder, get the victories of war from the morning skirmish. And the French were pushed back. Dieskau, the commander of the French, was wounded, as was William Johnson. Dieskau was taken prisoner by the British as well. So after that, because it's the French that are retreating now, they're heading back south. Next slide, please. So the third skirmish, and there's a place I think that many are familiar with, certainly by name, Bloody Pond. And although there's some dispute as to whether the Bloody Pond that's marked on Route 9 in Queensbury now or Lake George, is truly the Bloody Pond of history, it's certain that somewhere in that area is where the Bloody Pond happened. So what happened in the third skirmish is that the French are retreating, and the French are just kind of licking their wounds and seeing what they can plunder themselves from the dead from the morning's battle. And the British heard the noise from Fort Lyman, were sending troops up. They found the French there, and they overwhelmed them. They overwhelmed them so badly that so many French were killed, so many of their Indian allies were killed. When their bodies were thrown into the pond, the water turned red, according to legend, hence the name of Bloody Pond. And actually, there's 2 other times in history, although we won't focus on it too much, where Bloody Pond again came into play, whether it's, again, the Bloody Pond that's on Route 9 or not. In 1775, when Henry Knox led the Noble Artillery train from Ticonderoga all the way to Boston, and just an incredible, amazing feat of history. Bloody Pond was noted in his notebook as a place where the horses got spooked. Now, whether the horses were spooked because of the presence of some ghosts from the pond or bodies in the pond, or whether it was, as one other legend had it, a drunken soldier along the side of the road overnight that scared the horses. Bloody Pond is just loaded with legend. And then in 1780, the last Battle of Lake George, which we'll talk about a little bit, actually much of the death, the overwhelming by Christopher Carleton's forces of the British against the Americans happened there as well. But I digress. So three skirmishes, the Battle of Lake George. The British emerged victorious. William Johnson gets great kudos for that. Ultimately, he's named a baronet later that year, given the title for the rest of his life of Sir William Johnson, and things progress. Next slide, please. So it's, as I said, September, and we all know what particularly worse autumns and worse winters back in the 1700s were. Johnson gets a foreboding that the severe weather is about to come. Rather than embark on an excursion to Crown Point, which is about 15 miles north of Ticonderoga, he decides to settle in at Lake George. So that is when Fort William Henry is built, beginning in September of 1755 after the Battle of Lake George. And they create that. It's represented by the C on the lower right-hand side. This will come into play later when the French attacked the British at Fort William Henry, but that's when they decided, that was not in the original game plan, that's when they decided to build Fort William Henry, late in 1755. Next. Meanwhile, this is my favorite map. We have this on display in our visitor center. I just think it's so illustrative. So you see all the way up on the right is Fort Edward, formerly Fort Lyman. And you can see the way that road comes right through what's now Glens Falls, what's certainly Queensbury, and all the way to the head of the lake. Fort George, you see on the left-hand side there, the stockaded fort that was also built that we'll reference, the ruins of Fort William Henry. And you can see the Bloody Morning Scout ambush site in 1755, Bloody Pond a little bit to the left there, and places like 5 Mile Run by where Great Escape is now, certainly Halfway Brook, and the garrison grounds in Queensbury. Just a wonderful map that's done. It tells us, this is basically oriented to about 1759, the existence of Fort George, which wasn't built until 1759, but it's a nice representation of, I think, the large-scale bird's-eye drone view of what the area looked like in 1759. Next. So what happens in 56? The British settle in. Most of the provincial troops go home after the Battle of Lake George. Just the builders stay. They have an occupiable Fort William Henry by late summer, early fall of 55. 56, they kind of enmesh themselves in the area. They don't venture north again because it's not really sure what the French are doing. The French are basically at Crown Point, which they call Fort St. Frederick. At that point, Fort Ticonderoga, the French call Carillon, hasn't been built, but it's in their concept. And by late 56, Carillon, at the point basically where Lake George and Lake Champlain meet, is begun to build on the French side as well. Meanwhile, the British are building boats, and they're kind of scouting out the region because, as Margy said earlier, this area being such a point of contention between the French and the British, everyone wants to seek to have an advantage. Okay, so next, please. In 57, in March of 57 is when the French come and first see the British and plan to overtake the British at Fort William Henry. March, you know what the weather is like these days. Of course, it was a little bit more severe then in the 1750s. The French believed they could just kind of blast and bully the British out of there. They didn't succeed, but they severely harmed the British. Particularly, they blew up their boats, or set them to fire. They weakened a lot of the bastions of Fort William Henry. So the French couldn't overtake them then, but they did weaken them. And that comes into play later that same year when, next slide, when the siege of Fort William Henry happened. So on August the 3rd of 1757, under Montcalm, and a massive amount of troops, the French begin to attack. And you can see on the map on the left here, just what that attack vein is. Now I'd point out too, that in addition to Fort William Henry, you see a retrenched camp to the right there. That is where Lake George Battlefield Park is now. And there were actually more British in Lake George Battlefield Park than at Fort William Henry, because Fort William Henry only fit about 400 to 500 soldiers. And the British had, again, with provincials, sutlers, others who were hangers-on with the army, they had at least another 800 to 1,000 people to take care of. So they were basically out in tents in the middle of the field. And ultimately, after 6 or 7 days of a barrage of French attacks, the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Monroe, understood that they could not withstand this much longer. So, next slide, please. He decides to surrender. And I think, most of us know the story of The Last of the Mohegans, which is a fictionalized account of what happened next. But basically, the Monroe could not get help from Fort Edward. He surrendered. Montcalm gave him pretty generous terms in terms of being able to walk away with the honors of war, and the Indian allies of the French did not accept that. So as the British were beginning to leave the morning of August the 10th for Fort Edward, where they were given free passage, the Indians rebelled, and what's called the massacre occurred. They burned Fort William Henry. Fort William Henry was never to exist again in its short 2-year lifetime. But it certainly became, I think, a major milestone and certainly a name that would stick in the heads of the people, the British aligned residents and such from North America. So French victory. Some question as to why the French didn't continue on. They could have gone to Fort Edward with their massive forces. They certainly had momentum. Although the British did have some good-sized forces at Fort William Henry, it would have been a battle. But Montcalm felt that was enough. By this time, he had destroyed and decided not to keep Fort William Henry as a viable fortress. Fort Carillon at Ticonderoga was built and being used by the French. Fort St. Frederick, further up at Crown Point, was being used. So that was sufficient for this time, in Montcalm's opinion. So Fort William Henry's gone. Fort Edward still exists. What happens next year? The British never rebuilt Fort William Henry, as I said. In 1758, they gather forces and decide to attack the French at Carillon. And despite an overwhelming advantage, 17,000 soldiers sail from the head of Lake George. We have a beautiful diorama in our visitor center that depicts this. They sail from the head of Lake George on July the 5th, 1758. They go north. The flotilla covers over 6 miles, over 1,000 boats. What a spectacular scene that must have been. They go up to Ticonderoga. Despite having a 17,000 to 4,000 advantage in numbers, the French completely wiped them out. And the British sustained significant losses. Lord Howe, considered like a rock star, loved baronet from England, who was part of the British Army, was killed very early in the battle. And it seems as though a lot of the men lost heart at that point. Abercrombie, not being a strong leader, was pretty indecisive as to what to do next. They lasted throughout the day. By the evening, Abercrombie said, I think we head back to Lake George. So they make the 32-mile trek back south on Lake George. And that's it for the British in 1758. They have no fort at Lake George other than a stockaded fort, which is kind of a temporary thing. And interestingly, because of their fear of the French at this point, next slide, please, they sink their fleet They dismantle that stockaded fort, bury the timbers. They bury their cannon. They are so afraid of the French coming back, they basically are willing to start again in 1759 fresh, bringing up the boats, many of which they never recovered, rebuilding the stockaded fort, bringing the cannon back up, and so on. Meanwhile, the French, who were outnumbered massively, and the British had something like 700,000 residents in the colonies here in America. The French had 70,000. So the French were overextended. The strategy was made, next slide, in 1759, the British, again, we'll just have a competent general go in now, and we'll just overwhelm them. And the French recognized that the gig was up for them, that they couldn't sustain carry on, they couldn't sustain Crown Point. They best retreat and try to maintain what they have in what's now Canada. So that was their strategy. Amherst, before he embarks north, orders the construction of, or the reconstruction of the stockaded fort, orders the construction of a new fort to be called Fort George, which is the remnants of which we still have at the battlefield park. And they go from there. So they embark north, next slide please, and they overtake the French. The French basically try to destroy Fort Carillon and destroy Crown Point, or Point St. Frederick, so the British don't get it. The ruins are smoking and all that, but the British do salvage most of those forts. They take those forts, the French retreat to Quebec, and ultimately the following year, 1760, Amherst and others converge on Montreal, converge on Quebec City, and emerge victorious in the French and Indian War. Next slide, please. So that 1760 marks the end of hostilities in North America. Elsewhere, France and England were battling each other all over the world. Subsided, the hostilities subside, and in 1763, the Treaty of Paris is signed. Basically, France cedes Canada to the British, and peace comes, however tentatively, to North America. As this slide says, that the British rewarded many of their troops, those who wanted to stay in America rather than go back to England, or certainly the provincials who served here, they were rewarded. But still, obviously, as we know now, a disharmony kind of prevailed ultimately. Next slide. So, as the colonists begin to see things like the Stamp Act and certainly other acts by the British that far removed in England against them, they decide to rebel. One of the first instances, in April of 75 is when Lexington and Concord happened, almost an improvised thing. But by May, the following month, Benedict Arnold, probably self-initiated, and Ethan Allen, largely self-initiated, each decide to take Fort Ticonderoga from the British. And they succeed on May the 10th. And that puts Lake Champlain and Lake George corridor back in action in terms of combat. The following day, both Fort George at Lake George and Crown Point were taken by the Patriots. So those three key fortresses, Crown Point, Ticonderoga, and Fort George, are now in the hands of Patriots who are largely disorganized, certainly highly motivated, but not really sure of what the next step should be in terms of maintaining it. Fortunately, George Washington has come into the picture. The Battle of Bunker Hill happens in June, and further motivation happens. But the big question for the New Englanders anyway is that we still have the British hovering and running Boston, our major city, still with a large presence in New York, Philadelphia. How do we kind of cope with that? George Washington devises a plan. Next slide. And orders Henry Knox, and this is the great, incredible feat I referenced earlier, to go to Fort Ticonderoga, get the cannon that are there at Crown Point, and bring them that whole distance from Lake George, basically, to Boston in the dead of winter. And so Knox does it incredibly. He came to Fort George on December the 10th, I think it is, of 1775. He went to Ticonderoga, went to Crown Point, got the cannons and all that, and ultimately back at Fort George around December the 17th, stayed until December the 24th, all the time trying to figure out how he was going to logistically transport 60 tons of artillery over 300 miles, which ultimately he does. With the help of Philip Schuyler, when he left on December the 24th, Fort George, he went to Albany through a snowstorm and got Schuyler's assistance in organizing Teamsters to help him to move this massive amount of artillery. So he does it 300 miles, 6 weeks in the dead of winter. He gets to Cambridge, and ultimately the cannon are brought to Dorchester Heights outside of Boston. And on March the 17th, 1776, the British evacuate because of the imposing cannon artillery that they didn't know at all was coming to Boston, that the Continental Army now had. Next slide. All right, next up at Fort George in April of 1776, these three individuals come with the mission from Continental Congress to convince the Canadians to join the Patriot cause. And it's very interesting because not only because we have an incoming president who says we're going to take Canada back, but also because, the whole cry for independence right now, I think the Continental Congress assumed that the Canadians, now under British rule, many of whom are French, would welcome an alliance with them and similarly seek to free themselves of English rule. However, and despite the fact that Charles Carroll brought with him his cousin, who's the Bishop of Baltimore, John Carroll, because the French in Quebec were Catholic, they thought that having the bishop with him and Charles Carroll, as well as Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Chase, would help to convince them. But the British had done a very wise thing in 1760, 1763, when they assumed control of Quebec. They allowed religious freedom. And the Patriots were filled, quite honestly, with a lot of bigoted Protestants, particularly from New England, who, were very derogatory toward Catholics, spoke down and told them papists, they used to hang the Pope in effigy and things like that. And the Canadians resisted and ultimately turned down the opportunity to become the 14th colony. So Carroll, Franklin, and Chase stayed at Fort George on the way up to Montreal. Franklin at this point was 70 years old. And again, you can imagine how arduous that journey was, to go the length of Lake George, which still had ice floes in it in early April of 1776, and then to the portage, over the Lachute River to Lake Champlain, head north on Lake Champlain. And he said in his diary at many points, I do not think I'm going to survive this, but he survived. But they ultimately failed and they came back, but ultimately all three were in Philadelphia in July to sign the Declaration of Independence. Next slide, please. Another key milestone, and one that really, I think, permeates what we're doing now at Lake George Battlefield Park, is the smallpox hospital. The Americans militarily tried to take Canada in late 1775, early 1776, and they failed. Arnold was one of the leaders. He was severely wounded. General Montgomery was the other leader. He was killed. And eventually, as the Continental troops receded back down to Crown Point, Ticonderoga, many of them came back with smallpox. And so the decision was made then to segregate the infected from the non-infected, from the healthy troops. So the ones who came to Crown Point and Ticonderoga with smallpox were sent to Lake George, Fort George. And this military hospital was set up in July of 76. Over 3,000 patients were treated, hundreds of deaths, most of whom are, we believe, buried at Lake George Battlefield Park. But ultimately, several were buried more westerly up on the hills, which is the reinterment that's going to happen of the 44 I mentioned. They're presumed, they definitely died of smallpox. They were presumed to be part of the victims of the 1776 military hospital. But that was the largest Continental Army hospital in America, was there with Dr. Jonathan Potts being the overseeing surgeon. Next. So 77, a key year. General Schuyler issues orders for new schooners to be built at Lake George. So that was Fort George, again, was functional. So they wanted to build boats so they could have some mobility on Lake George, facing the threat from the British coming down from Canada. In July of 77, July 4th, July 5th, the British take Ticonderoga back. And it was hardly a fight, that there was nothing, that the Americans just weren't ready to fight such an overwhelming force under Burgoyne. So when that happens, they similarly decide to abandon Fort George and Diamond Island, which had some fortifications on it as well for the American troops. And ultimately, the British took them. Later in July through October, the British used Diamond Island and Fort George as supply depots for Burgoyne. So, there's been a lot historically said, why Burgoyne took so much time going south after they captured Fort Ticonderoga in July. They never engaged in battle at Saratoga until September. Wouldn't it have been quicker for him to go south on Lake George rather than go south to Whitehall and then have to go through the wilderness, basically, and all sorts of obstacles that the Patriots created for them to get through there? It's a question that can't be answered at this point, whether it would have been a better decision to come south on Lake George or not. But he did use the Lake George route as a supply depot. And Burgoyne was, highly reputed to have extensive supplies, not only for his personal use, like wigs and clothing and things like that, but also supplies that the troops needed, food for horses, other kinds of supplies that were necessary, were stocked at Diamond Island and Fort George as well. So after the battles of Saratoga conclude in early October, next slide, please. Fort George was evacuated by the British, Diamond Island, basically. So it was retaken, without resistance by the Patriot forces right then. And at that point, after the battles of Saratoga, the fighting of the revolution largely moved south. I mean, the strategy of Burgoyne was to separate New York and west of the Hudson River from New England, and therefore, cripple them. Well, that didn't succeed. So the Americans and the British both focused more. So more and more fighting would be in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and further south, the Carolinas, Georgia. So there wasn't a lot more fighting done in the Northeast. There were skirmishes. There were certainly raids. And in the next slide, please, you can see that the last major battle around Lake George was in October of 1780. Christopher Carleton came down the Lake Champlain Valley and raided parts of Washington County, Saratoga County, Warren County, including modern-day Glens Falls, Queensbury, Kingsbury, and up to Lake George. The ultimate act during this campaign of his was on October the 11th, when they overwhelmed a number of the small contingent of American soldiers who were there, probably in the low 20s, 23, 25, killed them. And an outpost at Bloody Pond was another part of engagement there. It's said that more bodies were thrown into Bloody Pond, but again, that's probably more legend than anything else. But ultimately, the American commander, Captain Chipman, surrendered, and Fort George, once and for all, was burned, and it was never to be a military factor again. Next slide. So the Americans, incredibly, emerged victorious. Yorktown happens in 1781, the period between then and 1783, when the Treaty of Paris for that war is ratified. It's just kind of like waiting, kind of festering. There's some disgruntlement on the part of Continental soldiers about being paid and being allowed to go back to their farms and their homes. But by and large, Washington did a superior job in managing that and leading through that. And ultimately, by the time of July of 1783 came through, he toured the Mohawk Valley, he toured this area. He famously, I think, stopped at Halfway Brook to get a drink of water, probably shopped at the outlets on Route 9.
Yeah, right.
And then went up to Fort George, saw Fort George, Fort William Henry, Fort Ticonderoga. And then, as I said, the final Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the revolution. Next slide. So we get back to the post-colonial war era, and Margy's going to take us through those.
Thanks, John. You're so well versed on that. I mean, he is. He's so good.
Not just making it up.
So in 1791, several years after the Treaty of Paris was signed, Thomas Jefferson makes the journey north into the wilderness to inspect the outposts, and in the famous letter that he wrote to his daughter saying, Lake George is without comparison the most beautiful water I've ever seen. And we can all likely agree with him on that. Next slide, please. So in 1810, the property that is now considered the Battlefield Park, Union College and Columbia University had title to the property from the New York State Regents. And I'm not sure why Garrett Cluett made this map, but he envisioned a village built up around Fort George, with Fort George as the center and plots 50 feet by 150 feet, and envisioning a village should be built there. But ultimately, that did not happen because in 1787, James Caldwell, who would start the village of Lake George by purchasing land from different patent holders, he purchased 1,500 acres at the southwest part of Lake George. And this purchase included lands that are now the village center. In 1810, he started to settle the village of Lake George where it is today, over on Shepherd Park on the west side of the lake shore, and not at the head of the lake as envisioned here. Next slide, please. So in the meantime, he's building the village of Lake George, and the land at the head of the lake, which is Fort George Park and Lake George Battlefield Park, was basically owned. He purchased a lot of that land, and in 1811 he purchased the land that includes the Fort George area. Let's see, where am I at? Okay. He didn't establish a village here. So 1892, the Society of Colonial Wars was formed in New York City, and Lake George Historical Association were both organized. And they were very influential in the purchase of New York State to purchase the land for the park. And in 1897, they passed the law. A lot of the local senators from Warrensburg and surrounding areas petitioned the state to purchase this land and to commemorate the Battle of Lake George. All right, where are we? Now, this early map, Edward Hageman Hall, he was part of the society, I want to say it right. He and a group of men from the Society for the Preservation of Scenic and Historic Objects and Places, they came to Caldwell to inspect the battlefield and make recommendations concerning the property. And at this time, the heirs of James Caldwell, the Niverts, Matthews, you can see their names on here, They owned the property, and then they eventually sold to the state. You can see where the railroad came in. That was 1882. The railroad came to the head of Lake George. So this is the property that the state purchased from the Caldwell heirs, which is now the Battleground Park. Okay, next slide. So the first battle monument was sponsored by the Society for Colonial Wars, and they commissioned the statue, and it was a bronze battle monument unveiled 148 years after the Battle of Lake George. And it depicts Sir William Johnson and King Hendricks. It was a 2-day affair. A grand ball was held at the Fort William Henry. Troops from Albany and Burlington, Vermont came, and the sculptor was Albert Weinhardt. $4,500 bronze statue and a $2,500 granite base. Next slide, please. Governors from New York, Connecticut, Vermont, Massachusetts all attended this unveiling. They were stationed at the four corners of the monument and unveiled the statue. President Teddy Roosevelt sent his regrets from Oyster Bay. He could not attend. So they've decided that the Fort George should be partially restored, and in 1921, the Lake George Historical Association and the Society for Colonial Wars decided that it's time to start working on the restoration of Fort George. Next slide. And many of you are probably familiar with the Indian monument that was sculptor Phimister Proctor. He used a Western Indian as his model for the monument. The statue was accepted by the New York State Historical Association by Dixon Fox, who was head of the history department at Columbia. And it was given by George Pratt, who was a former conservation commissioner, New York State. And it was dedicated to all the native people who once lived in the area. And the fence around it was erected in 1924. So that's been there over 100 years. Yeah, again, that other part didn't show up. Okay, so the Knox Trail, this is an important thing, which John had talked about earlier. These markers, there's 56 in all, and the first one is in the parade grounds at Fort Ticonderoga, and it says, from this spot, the cannons and mortars were taken. And the rest of them coming down, each one portrays one day in the journey. There's one in Sabbath Day Point, there's one in Bolton, and this one is in Fort George, and it says, through this spot. And they continued, there's one in Glens Falls, Crandall Park. So it's a whole trail. And coming in December of this year, we're going to commemorate his stay at Fort George. And so look for that in your notes coming up. But December 12th, I believe, right?
Yep.
The weekend of December 12th, we're going to have a reenactment and speakers and talk about that. Now, also in Fort George Park is the memorial for the unknown soldiers. And these bodies, these men, were accidentally discovered when the state was working on Route 9 in the 1930s. And here they reinterred them in the 1930s, and they're believed to be the soldiers, remains of the soldiers who perished early in the Battle of 1755, the Battle of Lake George, French and Indian War. And here we hold a service every Memorial Day honoring these soldiers and open to the public, and all are welcome to attend. And they're believed to be the oldest soldiers, American soldiers in the United States burial. Now, the statue of Father Jogues, he was the French ambassador to the peace to the Iroquois Confederacy. And it took several years for the committee who wanted to erect a statue in his honor to decide upon the spot. They looked from Ticonderoga to all the way down the lake and decided that it should be in a place of prominence. And they finally decided here at the Battlefield Park. And in 1939, there was a ceremony to unveil this. And thousands of people came. And I'd like to think my father was there as a young boy at that. He would have been 8 years old. I'm sure he was there. And also, there are beautiful stained glass windows in the small chapel at Sacred Heart Church right in Lake George that depict the life of Father Isaac Jogues. So you're definitely welcome to see that at some point too. But please come to the park and walk around. We have beautiful grounds, and tours are offered, weekends, guided tours, which is great. All right, next slide. The Park Pavilion is in the center of the park, which many of you are probably familiar with, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, as well as the Battlefield Campground that's adjacent to it. Local men built the Park Pavilion and the fireplaces and the campground as well. And many of you are probably familiar with Dr. David Starbuck, who sadly passed away several years ago, but he conducted archaeological field schools in the early 2000s, then again in 2014. He remarked that it was a great warpath and beautiful, and he thought that this place should always be preserved. And this past summer, we had a Skidmore College professor of archaeology, Dr. Siobhan Hart. She was there with some of her student team members, and they conducted an archaeological study there this summer, and we are waiting for her report and her show. So hopefully we'll be seeing that in the next couple of months, see what she has to contribute. And the Battlefield Park Visitor Center, hopefully many of you have been there. If not, it's open May through October, 5 days a week. We've done a beautiful job. The curation committee has done a beautiful job with artifacts on loan from the New York State Museum. And we have some beautiful artwork and some mannequins and the diorama from the Adirondack Experience, the museum at Blue Mountain Lake. That's beautiful. And you should definitely come and visit the park. And when you're there, and if no one is there in the entertainment center, the visitor center is closed. Outside, there's some newly placed signage, information signage, and you can pick up a Battlefield tour guide with information on the back. And this is outside the visitor center. John?
Okay, just a couple more things. And again, we thank you for your attention. So 2 major initiatives this year, and we're very excited about them. Number one, and you may have read about this in the newspaper very recently, there was a wonderful, highly regarded, internationally renowned sculptor who's from Lake George originally. His name is Dan George. I used to joke with him that Lake George was named for him, but he declined. As he was battling cancer, and unfortunately he passed away January the 5th, but he made it his final accomplishment, if you will. His career was spent in Brooklyn. He moved up to Kingston during COVID, but he made it his mission in his last months of his life to refurbish and guide us to refurbishing the three sculptures or statues in our park. Again, they date back to 1903 in the case of the William Johnson King Hendrick statue, 1921, the Mohawk Warrior, and 1939, the Isaac Jogues. And each of them is beautiful, but each has fallen in not disrepair, disrepair. They haven't been well taken care of. So Dan George's vision was to refresh, certainly to cleanse the granite that surrounds the Isaac Jogues statue, which has turned black with age, and to refresh the bronze so that the patina, a new word in my vocabulary, is consistent. So it's all of the same hue, despite the age and things like that. And there's also some structural repairs that are necessary as well. Isaac Jogues, for example, is holding a cross, which over time has bent because presumably a tree limb fell on it at some point. The wrought iron fence surrounding the Mohawk Warrior is broken in parts. The warrior itself is missing a couple of the arrows in his quiver because they were probably vandalized at some point. The William Johnson King Hendrick statue and its wrought iron gates, 4 hatchets on the entrance gate. Well, 2 of them have been missing for 30, 40, 50 years. All of these things are going to be repaired. And at this point, I'm happy to say we have the funds to repair the Mohawk Warrior and the Isaac Jogues statue. We've engaged a professional grant writer to hopefully come up with the money that's needed for the final sculpture of William Johnson King Hendrick. But as we talk about the second major initiative, the preparations for the reinterment in 2026, we have this vision of a beautifully restored park with these statues shining in the bronze with real luster, looking almost like new, despite there being, in the case of the oldest of them, 122 years old. So this is our focus, our emphasis, and make no mistake, we will succeed. We have a lot of people who have volunteered to support us financially and with labor as well, and we love all of that. I mean, we're a volunteer group. Neither Margy nor I is paid for what we do, and our board and all the members are similarly volunteers. So we're real excited. Next slide, please. Talk specifically about the reinterment, and you're probably familiar. It's almost 6 years ago now that these remains were found in the village of Lake George. It's taken that long for, number one, the State Museum to analyze them, to really ascertain that they were from 1776 or thereabouts, that they were Americans, non-Indians, and that they died a natural or a sickness-caused death, not the violence that others from the French and Indian War, for example, had suffered from. They finished those. They've identified that these remnants constitute 44 different individuals. They will be reinterred Memorial Day weekend 2026. We're in the midst of, we've already raised close to $100,000 to do that. We have grant applications in that we're very confident will take care of the rest of the need for that. But there will be ancillary needs, to maintain. You see the vision of a nicely groomed site, a very respectful site where people can sit and contemplate. We'll need maintenance money and things like that to maintain the grounds and such. So again, if people are interested in contributing or participating as volunteers, we encourage that. I think there's one more slide. Yes. So these are the kinds of things. We have the Repose of the Fallen brochure here. If you're interested in contributing to it, these are some of the mementos that are given to people who donate. You will be informed through the media, I'm sure, and if we have your email address, you'll be informed directly by us as to when these ceremonies take place. But the plan is for Friday, May the 22nd, 2026, I believe, at 11 a.m. to do that. And the governor will be invited. Senator Schumer has been a strong advocate of this. He says he will be there unless there's Senate business that precludes that. So we're very excited about what we have and how we're doing. Our mission really is twofold: to preserve what we have in the Adirondack, in Lake George Battlefield Park within the Adirondacks, and number two, to educate people and promote the idea of how special that is. So with these further actions, we feel that's the next step in terms of doing that. And beyond that, we will say thank you. Happy to answer questions either publicly or privately. And again, I encourage you to take the literature. We have our scheduled programs coming up in the next few months, as well as other kinds of information. So